I tried to make the case, I think a very strong case based on Mesopotamian material, that there was in the ancient Near East this idea of divine fluidity, that a god could fragment into different parts and yet retain a fundamental identity, that a god could have more than one body, especially in the sense that a god could be literally, physically present in several different statues all over the world, as well as remaining physically present up there in heaven, and that gods could overlap with each other. Their selves could mingle, the self of one god with another. Then we went to Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia to Canaan, and we saw that there seems to be a similar idea in Canaan, and that in Canaan, that idea was especially associated, the idea especially of the God being present in several different statues, was associated with the term matseva, meaning a stone pillar, and Beit El, meaning a house of the gods, so that the pillar was maybe imagined not as the god's body so much, but rather as a building, in a way, in which the god was housed. And the god could be present in many different Batei El, or in many different matsevot around the world. Then we went to Israelite material, and we saw that the same term, Beit El and matseva, is used among the Israelites. And based on this, I suggested that the Israelites also had this idea. In the case of Israel, I think that this idea has become a monotheistic idea. So you no longer have the idea of two gods overlapping with each other. That doesn't seem to be an option for the biblical authors who believe only in one God. But you do have the idea in ancient Israel that this God Hashem could become present in a matzeva, and probably in many different matzevot all around the land of Israel. So we get this same idea of multiple divine embodiment showing up in Israel. When God shows up that way, God can be referred to especially with the name Beit El, which becomes a name of God. And you can still use God's regular name, which is spelled with the letters Yud, He, Vav, and He. Now, this idea, we saw it in just a couple of texts. Let me just mention also that we have a lot of evidence that there were multiple matzevot in ancient Israel. For one thing, archaeologists have found multiple matzevot in ancient Israel. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen them in the Israel Museum, or if you've been to Chatzor, the little museum at Kibbutz Chatzor, they've got some of the matzevot that were found there on display. We also have evidence from some stories that the matzeva, the stone pillar, and also the asherah, the tree or the wooden pole, was regarded as acceptable by some Israelites who were monotheistic. I'll just give you one example, or two examples. Moses, in Exodus chapter 24, sets up 12 different matzevot at Mount Sinai during the covenant, the Brit ratification ceremony. Now, I'm sure that he was not setting up matzevot to 12 different gods. I think the idea was he's setting up these matzevot to all of them are holy to the same God, and he actually pours wine on these matzevot. Very similar to what Jacob did in Genesis chapter 28 at Bethel, at Beit El. I think that by pouring the wine on, he's bringing God into these matzevot. It's the Israelite equivalent of the pit pea ceremony. Similarly, there's a northern king named Yehu, a zealously monotheistic king, who reforms the northern temples and gets rid of all the appurtenances of Baal worship and Asherah worship, or goddess worship, I should say, in the northern temples. But he does not remove the Asherah from the northern temple. This zealous monotheist who is a worshiper only of Hashem doesn't get rid of the Asherah, and I think we can conclude from that for him, the Asherah was a perfectly acceptable monotheistic item. So the idea of multiple embodiment in several different statues, or really more pillars and sticks, this seems to have been an idea at home among some Israelites. I also want to look at the idea of, let's say, the small-scale manifestation of God in a little more detail. So the Malach of Hashem, which I think in this case means the avatar, for reasons that we'll see in a moment. So the avatar of Hashem, the small-scale manifestation, manifested itself or appeared to him, to Moses, in the form of a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. The bi in the phrase bilabat esh here, it could mean that God appeared inside the flame, but bi in biblical Hebrew can also mean as, in the form of. And in that case, this might be translated best as the avatar appeared in the form of a flame from the midst of the bush. And it wasn't just a regular flame, it was something unusual and special, because Moses saw, and look, the bush was burning in fire, or with fire, but the bush was not consumed. So this fire, it's not a regular fire, it's a fire that's inside the bush, but it's not burning the bush. It's just there, but it's not. But the bush itself is not on fire. There's flames at the same place, but they're not together, you might say. Now, the fact that God appears here in the form of a little flame, some sort of little flame in a bush, is very interesting to me, because this is Mount Sinai. This is the same place where in Exodus 19, a few months later, the revelation, the law-giving of the Torah will occur. And if you can remember from Shavuot or any other time that you've looked at Exodus chapter 19, God comes down in Exodus 19 as the kavod, and the kavod there is this gigantic flaming thing. In fact, it has to be surrounded by that black cloud I've mentioned before, because it's so fantastically bright, it would kill anybody who got too close to it or who saw it. So, at this exact same spot, God in God's full glory will appear as a gigantic flame, as a gigantic fire. What's happening now is, it's a little fire. It's not all of God's presence. It's just this small-scale presence in the form of a small flame, which is less frightening. Moses does get frightened, but it's not as frightening. It's more accessible. This is a user-friendly manifestation of God. This is a bite-sized manifestation of God. And I think this is a very good example of what malach means when it has this sense of the word avatar instead of messenger. It's the same thing as the kavod. It's at the same place, but a lot smaller, a lot more approachable. So we've got this great case of the avatar. Moses says, I want to go take a closer look at this. And then in verse 4, God sees that Moses has taken a look. Vayikra elav Elohim mitoch hasneh. And God calls to him, to Moses, from the midst of the bush. Well, what's in the midst of the bush? The flame. The flame, which is the same thing as the malach, because we're told that the malach appeared as a flame. So, it's not now an angel or a messenger who's speaking to Moses from the midst of the bush. We're told that Elohim, that God himself is talking to Moses from the midst of the bush. What's going on here, I think, is another demonstration that malach is equal to God, but not all of God. Because it's Elohim, it's God who speaks to Moses from the midst of the bush, and we know that the malach is what's located in the midst of the bush. And here I think we can equate malach equals Elohim. But from what happens months later, at the same location in Exodus 19, we know that the malach, this flame, is not all of God. This is just one nice example, I think, of the avatar idea. By the way, the bush, I think, is significant precisely because one of the things that can become an avatar is the asherah, is that pole that I've mentioned before, or sometimes it's a tree. I think what we've got here is an example of that. It's not a coincidence that it's a bush. God can become manifest in a stone pillar or in some sort of wooden living thing. Let's take a look at one more passage, which will be Genesis chapter 18, the story of Abraham and the visitors. So Genesis 18 in the Hebrew-English JPS is going to be on page 30. Genesis 18 in JPS is on page 30. And in the Jewish Study Bible, it's going to be on page 39. Page 39 of the Jewish Study Bible. So page 30 in JPS, page 39 in the Jewish Study Bible. Why is my computer not working? There we go. Genesis 18. Very odd. There we go. Okay, so let's just read through here. Again, I'm going to read in Hebrew, and you should follow along however you want to. Vayera elav Adonai be'elonei Mamre v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel kechom hayom. Hashem appeared to him, to Abraham, or manifested himself to Abraham, or became present to Abraham at the pistachio trees of Mamre. And he, Abraham, was sitting at the entrance to his tent at the hottest time of the day. He lifts up his eyes and he sees Shlosha anashim nitzavim alav. There were three men standing over him. That word nitzavim should sound familiar. What does it sound like? Matseva. It's from the same shoresh, the same verbal root as matseva. So he sees these men and he runs over to them and bows down to them. And he says to them, "O my lords," and this word "my lords" here, you'll notice in the translation, is not in capital letters. The Hebrew term being used here is not a word that necessarily means God. It's just a respectful term that you would use for other human beings. "O my lords, if I found favor with you, please stop here. Let me be your host." Abraham thinks that these three men are regular human beings. He has no idea that these are not regular human beings. They're just anashim to him. So he describes how he'd like to host them. He prepares a meal for them. He's really quite active in making sure that they'll have some good food to eat, that they'll have something to drink. And they say to him in verse 9, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he says, "She's inside the tent." And then one of them, now the verb switches to singular, one of them says, "I will certainly return to you. I'm certainly going to return to you next year, and your wife is going to have a son. There will be a son for your wife." Now Sarah heard this inside of the tent, and which was behind the man who was speaking. They were very old. It was highly unlikely that they would have children. She was 90. And so she laughed. She laughed inside of herself. Bikir ba. She laughed to herself, apparently not out loud, saying, "Is this likely at all?" Of course not. And Hashem says to Abraham, "Why did she laugh?" Now, what's interesting here is, well, how does he know that she laughed? She laughed to herself, bikir ba, inside of herself. But this isn't just a normal human being speaking. In fact, for the first time, the narrator has identified who is really speaking, who is standing in front of Abraham. It is, in verse 13, it is the Lord, it's Hashem. It's Yud-He-Vav-He is what appears in the Hebrew there. And as this text continues, we won't go through the whole chapter, it slowly begins to dawn on Abraham that he is not talking to three normal human guests. He slowly realizes that Hashem has come to visit him. It's a fascinating passage for our purposes in several different ways. One, here's an example of where God has a body, or maybe God has three bodies. It's not clear whether one of these men is Hashem along with two sidekicks, or maybe all three of them are actually Hashem. So this may be a rather banner example of multiple embodiment. Second, we're getting a very different idea of God's body from what we've seen before. Before, God's body was made of fire. It was scary. It was frightening. It was indeed even deadly. But this divine body just looks like a regular human body. Abraham didn't know he was talking to God. It's only as the conversation goes forward that Abraham slowly begins to realize my guests are not just a regular guest. So we're learning here that God's body can look like a regular human body. Maybe it can be even present in God can be present in three bodies simultaneously. Which is that classical Kabbalah, for example, in the Zohar or in Sefer HaBahir, imagines God or perceives God to have a number of different aspects. First of all, there's the true reality of God, which is simply outside of our universe and can never be comprehended or even approached by people like us in this universe. That's the Ein Sof. That's beyond our comprehension. There's nothing we can say about it. But the Ein Sof, because of God's great graciousness towards God's creation, allows a bit of God to leak into the world, to leak into the universe. And as God leaks into the universe or emanates into the universe, different aspects of God become manifest in the universe. Some of these aspects are more present in the universe, more accessible to us. Some are still closer in a way to the Ein Sof. And there are 10 of these aspects, which are called Sefirot in Hebrew. The highest of these 10 aspects is called Keter, it's the crown. Then there are various other aspects, some of them on one side that are a bit more law and justice and strictly oriented, others that are more mercy and graciousness oriented, and they come down ultimately until the lowest of the Sefirot, which is the one that is most present in the world, most accessible to us humans, which is known variously as Shekhinah or Malchut. So here the Kabbalists have taken the old rabbinic idea of Shekhinah and they've run with it further. They're saying it's one aspect of God among many different aspects that are evident in the world. And for them, Shekhinah now becomes an aspect that is maternal in nature, that's especially concerned with humanity and accessible to humanity, and therefore now Shekhinah is feminine. It's the feminine side of God. And what's interesting is that these different Sefirot interact with each other in complex ways. That seems almost pagan, as if though they're different deities. And yet, Kabbalah tells us, the Zohar tells us, different Kabbalists tell us again and again, all the Sefirot are simply aspects of one underlying reality. So that there is this unity that underlines what seems to our human mind to be a plurality, but ultimately it really isn't. It's just that our mind can't conceive of this amazingly complex unity, so our minds have separated it into these different Sefirot. When the New Testament talks about Jesus as being some sort of small-scale human manifestation of God, that's really, it sounds to Jews so utterly pagan, but what I'm suggesting is perhaps the radical idea for us Jews that in fact it's not so pagan. That in fact there was a monotheistic version of this that existed already in the Tanakh. And that the Christian idea that Jesus, or the Logos, the Word, as the Gospel of John describes it in its opening verses, that the presence of the Word or Jesus in fleshly form in a human body on the planet Earth is actually God making God's self accessible to humanity in a kind of avatar. This is what we were seeing in the J and the E texts. This is much less radical than it sounds. Or when the Gospel of John describes God's self as coming down upon and overlapping with Jesus, which is a famous passage early in the Gospel of John, that is actually a fairly old ancient Near Eastern idea of the reality or self of one deity overlapping with some other being. So this is not just Greek paganism sort of smushed onto a Jewish mold, which is the way a lot of Jews tend to think of Christianity. This is actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea, that is an old Semitic idea that is popping up again among those Jews who were the founders of Christianity. Even after the time of the New Testament, I think that we see this coming up in the doctrine, the post-New Testament doctrine of the Trinity. The idea of the Trinity really doesn't occur in the New Testament, but it occurs in early Christianity very soon afterwards. And we Jews have always tended to sort of make fun of the Trinity. Oh, how can there be three that is one? If they've got this three-part God, even if they call it a triune God, a God that is three yet one, really they're pagans. They're not real monotheists like we Jews are or like the Muslims are. Those Christians are really pagan. But I think that what we're seeing from what I've been saying in the past couple days is that, the idea of the Trinity, that there is this one God who manifests itself in three different ways, that's actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea that can function in a polytheistic context, as it did for the Babylonians and the Canaanites, but it can also function in a monotheistic context, as it does, I think, in the J and the E texts and some of the other texts that we were looking at. In fact, to say that 3 is 1, heck, the Kabbalah is going to go further than that. They say 10 is 1. The Zohar, Sefer HaBahir, they say 10 is 1. And actually, when you get to Luriana Kabbalah, and there's the idea that within each of the Sefirot, each of the 10 Sefirot has 10 Sefirot within it, so that we've got 100 different Sefirot, really. We're taking this reasoning much, much farther than the Christians did. So actually, one of the more radical conclusions that I came to, much to my own surprise, when I was writing this book, and this is not at all what I had intended to do, because in various ways that we could discuss if you're interested, I'm actually rather uncomfortable with my own conclusion here, but as a scholar, I got to call them as I see them. One of the conclusions that I came to my shock, when I finished this book, is that we Jews have no theological objection to the doctrine of the Trinity. We Jews, for centuries, have objected to the Trinity, have labeled it pagan, have said, well, that's clear. There you can see that the core of Christianity doesn't come out of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, what they call the Old Testament. Really, they're being disloyal to the monotheism of the Old Testament. Actually, I think that that's not true. To my surprise, I came to the conclusion, somewhat to my dismay, I came to the conclusion that we Jews have no theological right to object to the Trinity. Theologically, I think that the model of the Trinity is an old, ancient Near Eastern idea that shows up in the Tanakh, and that in a different way shows up in Jewish mysticism as well. Palestinians. There's plenty that we can disagree with, but it's not theological. Fundamentally, the theological model used by Christianity, I think, is one model that shows up in our own sacred literature, in the parts of the Tanakh, in the Zohar, in Jewish mysticism. I think furthermore that you can see, it's interesting if you read some of the church fathers or some Christian commentators on the story of Abraham and the 3 visitors, they make a linkage between that story and the doctrine of the Trinity. Those 3 visitors become a harbinger of, a hint at the later idea of the Trinity. For Augustine, much later on, for Luther, they connect Genesis 18, the 3 visitors, to their theology. And you know what? This is one of those cases of a much later writer saying something that seems very removed from the text, but actually at some very deep level they got the pshat. They're really correct that there is a linkage between the Trinity, the theological intuition that's behind the idea of the Trinity, and the theological intuition that is behind the story in Genesis 18.